Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of South Asia Research Institute for Minorities podcast series. It's a great pleasure that we have a special guest today. Our mission is to raise awareness about the challenges faced by vulnerable communities around the world, with a particular focus on religious minorities in conflict zones. In today's episode, we are privileged to welcome Mr. Daniel Williams, whom I'm grateful. Indeed, I know he has been traveling quite lately, and he just got away with the vacations of Christmas and holidays as well. He is also a distinguished journalist and author whose work has profoundly contributed to the understanding of religious persecution, with a special focus in the Middle East. Daniel's extensive research, including his book, which is Forsaken, The Persecution of Christians in Today's Middle East, has brought up to light the harrowing realities faced by religious minorities caught up in conflict zones. His reporting and analysis have underscored the complexity of religious, ethnic, and political violence, as well as in the international dimension of these crises. We are honored to have him with us today to discuss this very critical topic. In this conversation, we will explore the persecution of Christians, minorities in conflict zones, examining the multifaceted challenges faced by them, the role of global actors in either mitigating or exacerbating these issues, and the long-term implications for these communities. My name is Furqan, and I welcome you all to this podcast. Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for joining us for the first time on our platform at a very short notice, I must say that. So without I'm wasting your time, I would request you to tell us about yourself first, to those who are listening and watching us, and also walk us through what basically motivated you to write the book. Thank you. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I got interested in journalism way back in the 60s when I was drafted into the army. And this was a tumultuous time in the United States, mostly having to do with war and just war and whether it's what conditions war can be fought. Later on, I wanted to get into foreign reporting. This was my interest. This is what I entered into, and I was a foreign correspondent for 35 years. During part of that 35 years, wars, and we call them now endless wars, became rather frequent and common. For smaller, maybe under the Clinton, Ronald Reagan and Clinton administrations, then, as you know, longer. And we had one in Afghanistan that more lasted 20 years, and another that lasted 8 years in Iraq, and maybe it's going on today. I don't know whether I should say that or not. In any case, within that context, I did not a series of stories, when I was based in the Middle East, especially during Arab Spring time, in which I could go to country to country. There's always a story about some sort of religious suppression and repression, often affecting Christians. So I decided to put it in a book covering just the Middle East. I recognize that some of the issues I think we'll bring up today would apply to many religions. Religious minorities have problems operating, especially in dictatorial states, but in any time, and war is one of the big enemies of minorities, because when they're forced to take sides and then the side they're forced to take loses, they can run into problems. It's easy to blame minorities. It's your fault, and this has happened even as back far as World War II, but especially these days, and I would not say especially in the Middle East, but it's notable in the Middle East in country after country. My last job was with Human Rights Watch, in fact, after being a journalist for 30 years. And of course, that brought up the issue of international law and how that does or does not protect religious minorities.
Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for giving us the overview of your entire journey. And it's great to hear, and we will be learning a lot from you in today's podcast. So I'll ask you a question about some of the pressing issues, like what are some of the most pressing issues and pressing challenges faced by religious minorities in conflict zones, and how do these challenges differ depending on the region,
right,
or a specific conflict?
Yes. Again, we're in an era of conflicts. And as I pointed out in my book, but also in just my comments to you, that minorities, because they're minorities, and if they don't have any real, if their peace and security depends on a single government, when that government is overthrown or faces a conflict, they can be blamed. In this recent years, I say the past 30 years, we've had several of these, both internal and external conflicts, of which Christians, but other minorities, my book is limited to Christians, but I could say in several countries, wherever you're a minority, you are more or less asked and usually will adhere to, support for the government in power. And then the government's overthrown and people will point their fingers at you. This happened, for instance, in Iraq. This happened, maybe happening, or has happened in Syria. Let's take the Syrian case, which is very recent. The Assad regime, which lasted for decades and ended with Bashar al-Assad, always both played to protecting Christians and other minorities in Syria, and Christians, if at best, were silent. Arab Spring happens in the 90s. They, in fact, take the side of the rebels. Fine. Suddenly, they're fleeing the regime itself, and most of them went into Lebanon and so on. Assad is overthrown. Are they going to get the credit for that, for helping bring along this new government, which, by the way, is an Islamic government? Is more they're featuring themselves more in the line of Turkey, and let's say not Iran, but still we don't know yet what their situation will be under this new government. Will it be like Assad, where for his many faults coddled them a bit, was itself a minority government under the Alawi branch of Islam? Or will it be more like, we'll see, Iran, where it becomes the official state religion will be Islam, and therefore there will be certain aspects of Islam that will apply to them, of which, by the way, there's many aspects historically. It's not just the worst one, which we've had in some places, of real repression and violence, but there's several branches of Islam, and that's another confusion and difficulty for Christians. So there's 2 million Christians in Lebanon, perhaps waiting to go back. There's an equal number that fled into Kurdistan, thinking going back, not going back, still under this sort of messy democracy they have in Iraq. This is the dilemma for religious and maybe other, not just religious, but ethnic minorities. How to protect or from government repression. The easiest way is to at least support or at least be silent about things in the government, and what happens when it changes. This is a problem. It's a repeating problem, and it's certainly the problem in the Middle East.
Absolutely. And Mr. William, I must say that you are an expert on that. Is it a lack of political participation that they take in these conflict zones, or let's say in those countries? Because there's almost zero to lesser political participation, right? Because in the end, they would have to, yeah.
What we call in the West, this becomes controversial itself. We call in the West liberal democracy with ideas accepted in the West. I would say the United States, in a way, was a pioneer in this as a republic democracy that both protected religion and forbid government creation or support for religion. That has also expanded to other parts of the West, but it's not universal in a way. So let's just go to a little bit to the history of Islam and its development, because of course Islam is less centralized, at least certainly in this era, than it perhaps has in the past. When Islam came out of Arabia, I'm going to bore people with a little bit of history, way back in the Middle Ages. It comes out of Arabia into Christian land, Syria, Egypt. It was Coptic. Syria had a variety of Christian sects and so on. It was relatively tolerant in the sense that you can read in Islamic philosophy and philosophy in Arabic that there was a toleration. Was that just because there were so many Christians, or was it some sort of far-reaching idea? In any case, it was fairly tolerant as a religion. When the Crusades came, which is rather later, but still a few hundred years later, the Crusades created a problem. And this is where I get to the second half. There's the issue of what kind of government you have, and then what's the geopolitical situation. War is a big enemy of minorities. Again, you want to take the side of the government in power because you need their protection. When that government is challenged, you have to choose. In the Fourth Crusade, the First Crusade, when the Christians from Europe attacked Egypt, the Coptic Church, which had a real problem with Rome, not so much with the government in Cairo, supported the Islamic government, or the Islamic-based government in Egypt. The Fourth Crusade, something else happened. The Armenians and other Christians in Palestine, in fact, favored the Crusaders. The Crusaders lose. This is a problem. The Mamluks, who were ruling Egypt and were the great liberators of the Middle East at that time from the Islamic point of view, said that, okay, well, there were more restrictions put on Christians after that. So again, choosing sides in a war, and in this case they chose the losing side, the Crusaders, creates problems. I'm going to fast forward to the 20th century and the 21st and the century we're in now. Something new cropped up. It cropped up from writers who supported the Islamic State, first the Islamic State of Iraq, and then the Islamic State of Iraq and Shams, which is another word for Syria. They say Christians don't belong at all in the Middle East. This is Islamic land. They are agents of the West, of the Christian West. I'll read you a quote from the Islamic State of Iraq a few years ago. Here's what he says. We believe that the factions of the people of the book, which is the Quran, and those of, people of the book, the Christian Bible, and those of their ilk, such as, and they list some other Gnostic group, other small minorities in the Middle East, a people of war, not enjoying a status of protection. They're not protected under Islam. This is new, and it's a minority position. I don't want to say it's a majority position, but this is something the Islamic State wrote about. If they desire security and safety, they must create a new pact with the Islamic State in accordance with the conditions of the Pact of Omar. Now, this is a medieval thing, but it's what ruled for many centuries. Then they go on to say, if the Muslims defeat the Christians and polytheists, other religions, this causes distress among the, they even talk about Shiism here among them. And if the polytheists and Christians beat the Muslims, this occasions a holiday and joy. They are not Muslims. They are sects that follow the path of the Jews. This is a whole other issue that I don't want to get too much into. And Christians in lying and infidelity. These are accusations that say they can't live there anymore. And this is a new aspect of the Islamic State. And therefore, they should all leave the Middle East. That's the point. And indeed, they've been driven, or feel they've been driven out of Iraq. Certainly Syria, they're wavering. But it had an effect at other places where certain factions of Islam, including the Salafis, which is a very conservative thing, also began to assault Christians in those countries, even in Egypt, without an invasion from outside or without this kind of ideological thing. We'll see it also even in Israeli-ruled Palestine, Israeli part of Israel, that the Christians, for a period, and I think they saw this was very bad, how should I put it, bad publicity, settler groups began to assault Christians in the West Bank. They were tearing down minarets of some, minarets would go up in small ways, they'd come and attack. This is also suggesting that they don't belong in Palestine. Now, I'm just going to point out in the Israeli case, of course, the government did crack down on this, and you don't hear too much about this, but it does, you only have to tell the Christians once they don't belong, and they begin to look for visas elsewhere. So you have the two issues: totalitarian or authoritarian governments force minorities, and majorities for that matter, to abide by their rules and support them. Second, war is an enemy of minorities. It puts them in a difficult position. You see it in Arab Spring in Syria. They sided with the democratic rebellion at the beginning. Bashar al-Assad cracks down. They have to flee. Now, do they go back or not? What kind of state is Syria? I don't have the answer to that, actually, but we'll see.
Yeah, thank you so much for comprehensively providing us the two aspects. Yeah, the historical overview, and thank you so much for that. I'll jump onto your own, creation. I would say your entire work basically relies on that book, I must say. In your research, which is like the book, I would say, for Forsaking the Persecution of Christians in Today's Middle East, you highlight the targeted violence against religious minorities. Could you please elaborate on how religion intersects with ethnic and political tensions to fuel this persecution? You did say that, taking sides, and they're indecisive whether whom to support, and what happens if the person gets, ousted for whatever reason.
Yes, I mean, the Middle East in particular is, of course, the home of multiple religions, three of them believing in one God. Others have different views. And there's a religious sequence: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Just, I'm saying, by the calendar, not by importance. Each one claims to be the true, we've gotten a revelation from God, basically. And that's difficult. It's a difficult pie to cut up. It's you have to say, well, yes, we're the best, but we like the other ones. The other ones are okay. And they've tried that, especially in recent years in Christianity. Again, there's always someone who says, no, we can't tolerate these people. We can't tolerate Jews. We can't tolerate Christians. Or Christians say we can't tolerate Islam, because Islam essentially rewrites the Bible in the Quran, the Christian Bible, Jewish Bible in the Quran, with a different outcome in a way. That they were minorities, and maybe at the time when there was a sultan running all of Islam, or a church in Constantinople ruling all of Christianity, these things could be kept under control. You see it even in kingdoms where kings, they pretend to be and they act act as if they're the fathers of all the nation. These things can be suppressed. It's, again, difficult. One, when the legitimacy of the Sultan in Istanbul might be accepted by all Muslims. He's gone now. He's a long time gone. The legitimacy of the Pope might be accepted, but then there's many sects of Christianity who don't accept the authority of the Pope. When that breaks down, then lots of things can happen. There's always someone who always say, no, you are accepting apostate religions, even within Christianity, even within Islam. And this is a problem that in these days, when a government like the Assads or Saddam Hussein would be another one, the legitimacy is questioned even from within. Forget about what's happening outside. From within, let's say Saddam Hussein by the Shia, Assad by Sunni, mainstream Sunnis. They depend also on even the minorities to support them. They spend on, you have to give in to them. And this is a problem when there's a change, and especially at a time of conflict now, where there's invasions, Israel in Gaza, Israel now in Lebanon. This always calls into question the abilities of the minorities to exist in a place where they have to choose sides. If they choose the right side, whatever that means in some countries, they can survive, may even be rewarded. If they're blamed for the government that's repressive, they will be blamed. And you see it again in Iraq and Syria. This happened. In Egypt, it didn't quite happen. Arab Spring, there was some outbreak of anti-Christian activity, especially after Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, took over. The Egyptians didn't accept that. That was one of the aspects they didn't accept. But it's always there, right? It's our time. You supported the military regime of Egypt for 40 years. Now you should get out. That it can be suppressed, but it would be probably better suppressed if it was suppressed in writing, applied to all governments of Egypt or Iraq or Syria. That's not necessarily the case. It depends on the person in power, and that's always a problem for minorities, and not just the Christians, minorities everywhere, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying going on these days that history will tell who chose the right side. So it's about taking the right decision in crises, basically. So I'll jump to another question, which is based on your experience. You talk about taking sides. I'll ask the neutrality of it. What role does international community play in either mitigating or exacerbating religious persecution in conflict zones? What more can be done to hold perpetrators accountable?
Yes, this is an interesting question, because there are several areas where humanitarian law and human rights law does not cover this issue. Human rights law generally comes after World War II. Problems created by a state, specifically the state of Germany, the Nazi state of Germany. So human rights law applies, and applies in fact to religion. That's one of the ethnic groups and so on. They are also protected under human rights law. And Western states, and I think most states in the world, at least in word, if not deed, they accept this definition. Now there are other actors. I bring up again the Islamic State in the Middle East, and maybe other places, not just the Middle East. It's tricky, because there's no law that mentions what we call now non-state actors. Islamic State is a non-state actor. It may be supported by this government or that government. It's a non-state actor, and that you will not find that phrase anywhere in humanitarian law. The law should be changed to reflect changing possibilities of persecution. The Islamic State, and that's things I was reading before, and all this book is full of this kind of thing, is not a state. It's a movement, a cross-border movement. And there's no law that actually applies to them. There is now, I worked for Human Rights Watch for a while. My last jobs were 4 years in Human Rights Watch, and I understood that very well. And Human Rights Watch has understood it, and they can say that this group or that group can be criticized on war crimes. But most crimes against humanity refer to a state. That should be revamped. It's time to rewrite some of that. There's also the question, this is not exactly related, are economic refugees, should they be given asylum or not? This is strong in Europe, and a question also in the United States. But the question of what states do as opposed to what violent movements, even if the violent movement is trying to overthrow a dictator. It's easy, for instance, to say, or it's easier to say that Hamas in Gaza, when they crossed the border into Israel and killed about 1,200 civilians, created a war crime. Although Hamas is in a sort of a government, although it's not a government of the state exactly, still it could apply there. And it's easy to say Israel's a state. The International Court of Justice saying Israel has committed war crimes. That applies to states. But what about, let's say Hamas was overthrown and became just an organization that practiced terror, in which, because I remember in the second Intifada, the Hamas was blowing up civilian targets inside Israel. It would be best to have it clarified internationally that this is a crime as much as a crime as state crime, state oriented or state crimes committed by a state. Now, I way back talked to a gentleman who was involved in the Algerian Revolution. So we're talking about the 50s. And I asked him about this. He said, because the Algerian rebel movement against the French was not based on religion. It was a secular movement. Nonetheless, they blew up civilian targets within Algiers and other places. He said, well, we were fighting a colonial government that was repressive and so on in Algeria. He didn't accept any parallel with what was going on with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in other countries. But they are secularists, so they justified it in not the means, but the goals, which was to overthrow in that case, an occupying power in Algeria. The religious Islam and Christians and anyone else who rebels against the government, at least in the Islamic State case, is justifying it in Hafiz al-Assad in Iraq or whoever is doing. They're evil, so we can use all means possible, including blowing up civilian targets. The international community, such as it exists today, if you can say it exists, given all the wars going on, should take up this issue. You can't just leave it in the ether, or for Human Rights Watch to sort of find a way to deal with it. When I'm in Algeria, I wrote a report about abuse of the Nigerian army against civilians in their fight against Boko Haram, which is an Islamic group that also practices terrorism, and abuses of Boko Haram against civilians. They took it and they were finding ways to put it in the form of international law. We could do better. The world could do better. I don't know if the world could do better in the situation now where there's so many wars going on, but they can do better.
This also, thank you first of all for elaborating that point in the role of international organizations. This also, brings a question that don't you think it's contradictory or it's unfair to make responsible or the entire community for the actions of non-state actors like IS and all the other groups? So how do you, respond to that when it comes to, let's say if certain Muslim community is being labeled because of whatever the actions the non-state actors are doing. So how would you take that? I mean, in the other country, and the entire international community goes on to, blame that country for whatever actions have been taken or been done in the name of, let's say, a certain religion.
Yes, well, let me just say at the outset, because we talked about it as Islam, that I owe my life as a foreign correspondent, my physical life, a lot to Muslims, who are my translators, who are my assistants, and so on. So I know a bit about the way people actually act in the great majority of Muslims, and even the great majority of Christians. So the way the blame is apportioned in a sort of general sense to Islam or to other religions, of course, is wrong, and it shows no kind of intellectual basis for that. There's no reason to say all of Islam practices or somehow more susceptible to terrorism or attacks on civilians in any other religion. So, and there have been efforts, especially when George Bush II was talking about what Al-Qaeda done in New York City and Washington, tried to not excuse, but suggest that it was not an Islamic thing, that it was a terrorist thing. And he was very careful about that. I'm not sure he had full success in that, but at least he tried. But again, it would be better rather than appointing, depending on opinion. George Bush says this, but it should be more clear in international law what is a war crime and to whom it applies to, not just states, but other people. That there's a certain point you should not a line you should not cross, even if your cause is just, even if you're fighting Hafiz al-Assad or Saddam Hussein or other or the French occupation and colonial occupation of Algeria. There's limits. There's limits in war. There's such thing as just war in the West, and this is a constant issue of debate. What is a just war exactly? But at least some of it is written in law. In non-state actors are some in a kind of a ether of confusion about what is a war crime committed by an individual.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for at least supporting what we normally think about, blaming the entire religion or the entire community for smaller actions of certain groups. You did talk about the role of minorities in conflict zones, and which side do they take? My next follow-up question basically is that religious minorities often find themselves confined in the crossfire between competing ideological forces, right? And how do these communities maintain their resilience? I know they've been fighting hard for many years. And what are some successful strategies for their survival in these harsh environments? You did give us the indication about this as a successful strategy, taking side for certain time and then, then decide. So yeah.
It's of course difficult, and here we're talking about a religious aspect, but we can look at Russia as another place in which religion is used by a regime, a secular religion, of which now Vladimir Putin is constantly lighting candles in Orthodox churches all over Russia to show how religious he is, in which there's a controversy today about the late patriarch of the Russian Church, Orthodox Church, and his position on the war in Ukraine. So it's not related. It's not directly related to conflict between religions. It can also be a conflict between just a dictator and his search for support, no matter what, however even fake it is, from every group in society by coddling them, by saying, "I'm your protector." The issue is how to get them not to feel that they need a Putin or a Saddam Hussein to protect them. The issue is to have the overall society and constitutional makeup of society protect them. That's difficult when you have a dictator. I mean, it's clear that the Vladimir Putin, again, we're off the religious issue now into, if there's a Russian constitution here and there, but I mean, where he's throwing people in jail left and right over non-religious issues, but he is using religion. The true Orthodox religion supports Russian nationalism as defined by him. So it's not an issue of minority versus the state. It's an issue of the religion supporting the state, a formal religion supporting the state. In the case of these countries with mixed ethnic and religious populations, of course, again, I've repeated this sometimes and again, minorities are ultimately vulnerable to a dictator because he can be cruel. They know he can be cruel. And you take the Assad regime, but also Saddam Hussein, but especially we've seen what the Assad regime does to its enemies. It's easy for me to say you should stand up, but who's really? I've not lived in Syria, so it's easy. You must stand up against Hafez al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein or even Nasser or whoever in the past. If you're a leader of a community, you're a priest or a bishop. It has happened once in a while, but I mean, I can go to other secular governments putting bishops in jail, Nicaragua. It is difficult. I'm not saying this is easy. It would be better if they could also point to international law, at least something that the community, the so-called international community, agrees on. To do alone, it can happen, but you end up, 6 feet under sometimes.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. So yeah, on this note, you talked about.
I can talk a lot.
Sure.
But I do it.
Absolutely. So I'm really enjoying and intrigued about how your method is really amazing in putting things in a right way, and it would be very fruitful for our listeners and for our audience as well, for especially in political science students as well. I must say. There's another question related to the political science aspect of it. You talk about how minorities are treated under dictatorial rules, such as the case with Russia, or such as the case with Bashar al-Assad. What about the plight and victimization of minorities in countries who supposed to call themselves democratic countries, but are now on the verge of taking or finding the footsteps of autocratic regimes, to sway their will. Again, you rightly quoted that minorities are the ones who are always vulnerable. And I always had interactions with people like you and with the former special rapporteur, Dr. Furqan, who always, says that minorities are always being scapegoated, whether it's in the West, right, whether it's in South Asia or Global South, or whether in Rohingya as well. So how do you take the countries who label themselves as the democratic countries, but are on the verge of following the autocratic or some of the systematic or the style of their politics as well?
Yes, that's a good question, and we're in a way now we're not dealing on just dictatorships, and this is a wise thing to do at this point because we see in Europe and the United States and Europe, including Britain, the issue of new arrivals legally and in the United States perhaps illegally or not under the law, and xenophobia. That's what we're talking about in a way. They're linked when the state seems to lose. Part is when the state seems to lose control of the borders. in the United States. Donald Trump, and one of the maybe 2 or 3 main issues he ran on and won on was immigration across the Mexican border into the United States. There you have a little less issue that we're talking about, religious issues. It's more of an economic, legal issue. In Europe, though, you have other things arising. There were riots, unrest in front of the Cathedral of Milan recently. A group of third-generation arrivals, probably from Tunisia, I'm not sure, from North Africa in any case, rioted and were going through what is usually a plaza full of people, just walking and strolling and shopping and so on, stealing things, saying, I can't even use the language, giving the finger to the Italians generally. Now, their justification, at least online, what you can see online, is the Italians treat us badly, we're going to treat them badly. That's basically their line. This isn't helpful in a way, but it shows that, of course, it's true that in Italy, there Arab populations, which is the longest running immigration from Africa into, are kind of outsiders. There's no question they're outsiders. And there's no question that there's a kind of discrimination in this country where I am now. It doesn't have the history of the United States, at least on paper. Everyone's welcome. Melting pot. It used to be called the melting pot. We're all going to be American, whatever that means. But the very fact that they feel alienated in the third generation of living in this country is a problem. Now, someone's going to accuse me of saying, well, see, they riot and you justify it. No, but I think the problems have to be recognized in some fashion. And again, my experience, but maybe it's just me, is that most people are reasonable. There's certainly going to be people, for one reason or another, maybe they do feel oppressed in Italy. I don't doubt that they do, in fact, in many cases. But most people will want to resolve these problems and integrate in some way. We talk about it in France. We see this right-wing revival, one might say, in Europe. It's easy to say, well, but these people are Nazis. I don't think that's quite enough. I'd say the people who are anti-immigration, they have issues of law, they have issues of culture, they have issues of not having a real, a real history of assimilation. What does assimilation mean is the question. Must you all speak the same language? Must you all eat the same food? It's hard to say. But these issues have to be taken up, and they have to be taken up across the party lines. Will that happen? Because the right wing in Europe, certainly, and also in the United States to some extent, is able to play on this. In fact, the immigration issue in the United States can be resolved through law. But the Republican Party and the Democratic Party want to please a small segment of their population. On the Republican side, we don't like immigrants. We don't like these immigrants certainly coming on board. The Democrats say, we're thinking of the human aspect of it. There's something in between that has to be resolved among the parties. And that's true in Europe. But it has to be resolved seriously. It has to be recognized. There is a problem, and it is not just crime, and it is not just a free entry into a country. I don't see that being done anywhere. Here in Italy, the immigrants are gathered around the train station. And that's okay when they're gathered around the train station. When they begin to go to the main plaza of Milan, which is also a crime problem in Milan, a lot of it is driven also by immigrants, then it's noticed. And then it becomes this political football, rather than, okay, we have immigrants. We're a country with not a great history. Italy is a country that sends migrants out of the country, not accepts them. And this is true. And again, Germany has another history about foreigners, about non-Germans. France also has this long-time Algerian population, yet they too seem not quite assimilated into the country. And what does assimilation mean? In France has a history, for instance, the whole question of the hijab, I'm saying the Arabic word, the veil, right? They are completely against it. There's a law against it now, this kind of thing. Is that acceptable? Is it a piece of French history that must be preserved or not? But they have to be taken out openly. It can't be this constant thing where every election they talk about it and so on and so forth. And especially when it tends to bring other issues to the surface that are perhaps less dictatorial ideas or against law, what to do with migrants. Here in the United States, or over in the United States, they were discussing about the question of deportations, mass deportations, they call it. Will this be under the law that exists in the United States? Will it be under a special law? What about using the army to guard the border? These are all new things, but I can tell you that the two parties are not going to come together on this. There's not going to be a bilateral hearing between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on this issue, a commission to set up maybe in past legislation to resolve it. It's a political football in the United States where the extremes, you need the votes of the extremes too. That's what the parties have decided. And if you, in a country like this where the elections are very tightly contested, they will play to the worst instincts. You see it with Donald Trump, but even on the left side, they pretended that illegal immigration was not happening. No, the people know it's happening. You have to deal with it on both sides.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for bringing this up. And Poland is another country that is, massively imposing, bans or immigration, or making some stiff policies as well. Canada very recently has adopted a very stringent immigration policy, especially what happens, due to the transnational terrorism. There's another issue that we might discuss in this episode, if you allow, if time allows it, because we are also just left with two questions. Since you've
Okay.
covered, you worked with Washington Post and Human Rights Watch as well. Since we are now living in the era of digital media and social media, in your view, how has the global media's coverage? I would also want your opinion on digital media as well, on religious persecution and conflict zones, shaped international public opinion, or and policy as well. Are these aspects of those crises that are often overlooked in mainstream discourse?
It's not that they're overlooked, but they're not necessarily discussed in a kind of reasonable fashion. That is what I said about politics generally, where one party will take one position and the other party will take the other position, and the twain won't meet. They won't discuss generally that this is an issue that's not going away. One says no immigration, the other says, oh, let's let them in. That's not going to be acceptable to parts of the population. The media in the United States, but I think this is also true in parts of Europe, certainly, and I can't really speak too much for Asia, is reflecting that. In Italy, where I'm now, there are right-wing papers and left-wing papers, and they have completely different views. So no one is ever saying, well, let's get together and figure this out. Let's take the issue of there's a murder in the United States of an immigrant, not an immigrant, I take that back. He was an American citizen, but a Muslim. He killed a woman. Most papers focus on the fact that he was not an immigrant, because that's what Donald Trump first said. He must have been an immigrant. He killed this person, and he came across the border illegally. They didn't mention Islam until somewhere deep in the story. The right-wing papers in the United States put Islam in the headline. Islamic blah, blah, blah kills woman. So you see there's an effort on one side maybe to, well, let's not talk about the Islamic aspect. He seemed to have said that he was influenced by the Islamic State. He said it online. These people say a lot of things online, and he said that. So Islam played some role, whether it's mainstream Islam or not, it played some role. Trump focused on immigration, but now, when it was turned out that he said that the Islamic State influenced him, they focused on that. Whereas the other papers, the one might have said the pro-Joe Biden thing, played that down. They didn't want to deal with that. You have to deal with it one way. I don't think you have to deal with it the way that many European politicians deal with it, that Islam is bad, right? It's a dangerous thing. But you cannot not deal with it. If he says outright, the Islamic State, and what is the Islamic State after all? There's a very clear idea of the Islamic State policies vis-a-vis civilians and others. You cannot not deal with it. And that's the problem when you have this kind of bipartisan thing. One side will not deal with some issues and deal with only one issue. He's Muslim. The other will say, oh, well, the Muslim's not the thing. He's American. So he was in the army, in fact. He has some medals or something. That's what's important. They tried to put it in the question of regular domestic crime. And this is a problem of the press, but it's a problem of politics. That middle ground, that maybe I'm living in a dream world that there was a middle ground here, but there was a middle ground does not seem to exist, even in many issues, and that's one of them, that they're either for or against. And there's a very emotive, especially when there's a killing like this one, and there's been other killings about immigrants, nothing to do with Islam, having to do with immigration, that have happened. And then when the emotions take over, it's difficult to. So what happened in Milan the other day? No one was killed, but it's quite shocking to see on YouTube. You can go see it on YouTube, just Milan riot cathedral, and you'll see things, people giving the finger to Italy. That doesn't sit well with most Italians.
Yeah, and that's why I said, because we are living in the digital world, and a lot of information comes in a way that is, majority of them are unverified, or let's say the element of disinformation, misinformation always comes into play in this digital planet, or the digital world that we are living in. We just have one question left for this podcast. I would want to jump another question, if you allow. Like, what was the response of your book? I mean, if you segregate the country-wise. I forgot to ask that question. How was, not country-wise, region-wise?
Yes, the book was published in English, but also in German, although I have to say that the German translation was not adequate, was not very good. But in Europe, it got some attention. It sold a few thousands of copies in Europe, especially England, where there were some reviews and so on. In the United States, I should show you the cover. I thought the cover was a good cover. I didn't choose the cover. I thought it was a good cover. It has a church that's burning in Cairo. I think in the United States, showing this is considered, if you can see even the cross up there, it's a burning. It's in Mbaba, the neighborhood of Cairo. I know the church very well. And also the whole idea of Christian persecution is, in a way, is a weirdly more sensitive subject in the United States. We've had racial issues for years and years, and we've had class issues off and on for a long time. We try to pretend we don't have a religious issue there. So Europe, which, for better or worse, recognizes there's some issues based on religion, dating from the Crusades, one might say, dating from the distant past up to the present, will deal with it. And therefore, I had lectures in Europe. I had one lecture in Washington, in the United States. That was it. I went to a Catholic bookstore in the United States to see maybe they'd be interested. Again, I think the cover scared people off. I handed it. She was a nun. I said, "You might be interested. If you're interested, you can order the book." She looked at it and gave it back to me. She didn't even take the copy I was offering. It was like I'd given, I don't know, Beelzebub, the devil or something, and tried to give it in her hand. I think the established church, and maybe even the Catholic Church itself, is reluctant to take this issue up either among their parishioners. They will say, yes, we love Palestine, we love this, we love that. But the issue of cultural conflict or religious conflict, I don't think they want to deal with. They certainly don't want to use phrases like, the suppression of Christianity in the Middle East. I understand it's not easy, but then, we have a leader anywhere who's going to take this up. I'm sure we can find one, but maybe you know somebody. I don't know.
Sure, I can definitely do some homework on that as well, if you allow. Perfect. And then on this note, I mean, you talk about that Christianity is really a serious subject matter in the United States, and I always, kind of fancy why the Western Christians, let's put it this way, do not care much about what is going on with the Christians of the South. Let's put it this way. How would you react to that? Question.
It's as if I can't really answer it. I can think of some ideas that some of the churches in the Middle East are practically unknown.
So that's a huge majority, because Christianity is a huge population, right? But
I'm talking about the Middle East alone, though. In Syria, yes, there's 2 million Christians. That's true, but there's other sects there that date from the birth of Christianity. So it's ignorance. That's number one. Number two, within Christianity there are rivalries. After all, there's rivalries between Catholics and Protestants. That's traditional, but also between aspects within the Protestant churches that kind of detract from real Christian, not unanimity so much as solidarity. They're all Christians, but Christians have fought many wars among themselves, so it's not like they all necessarily get along. So there's a kind of lack of focus on Eastern churches here, but also in Asia. The popes occasionally visit East Asia, Central Asia, but they don't. It's nothing that takes hold in a way. There's more interest in Palestine, Israel, because Jerusalem is there. So some Christian sects take great interest in the fate or the destiny of Jerusalem and Christians there. Although, let's face it, the population of Christians in Palestine is going down. But as far as interest in churches in Syria, in Iraq, and not to mention, in general, there are other sects that are not Christian at all. Zoroastrian is a Alawi, minor Muslim sects. There's not much interest. That is, the general interest in religious freedom tends also to be sectarian. We want to protect the Christians. I'm sure the Muslims in India want to protect the Muslims in India. I'm sure in East Asia, it's more of a political communism versus a religious freedom in a place like Hong Kong. Religious freedom in China has already disappeared, reached revival and disappeared, with the Communist Party burning down or taking down churches and destroying churches that were built in this town and that town. So there's not a general solidarity in Christianity. Neither Christianity nor Islam nor even Judaism are actually monolithic. There's a pope, but he's Catholic. There's a patriarch, but he's Orthodox. There's other leaders. There's a Coptic patriarch or leader in Egypt. So there's not institutional solidarity. And on this issue, it's tricky. It's tricky for the Pope even to speak of each individual. For instance, I remember he made a speech and he didn't mention the Uyghurs, which is Muslims up in northwest China. I don't think he did it purposely, but it's something he left out in his list of people being persecuted. So within the religions, there's not solidarity. That is, between Christianity, within Islam, there's an issue, right? Are the Salafis wrong? Is the ISIS state wrong in there? There's nobody in Constantinople to say, I set the tone here. There's no pope in Islam, as you know, and there's not even a pope. There's not a pope in a pope equivalent in Judaism, and I don't know too much about the other, non-uni God religions. But there's that issue, and then there's just it's distant. Who are these people in the Middle East who are being persecuted exactly? What is the Coptic Church? There are some Copts in the United States, but tiny number. So it's both a lack of. I mean, Pope John Paul II had interreligious meetings in Italy on occasion. I don't know that they took up this issue very strongly or strongly enough. I don't feel that they did in a way. But he had also Jews and Muslims, and I don't know who. He had American Indian preachers there. They had all sorts of stuff. But did they actually take up the issue of real tolerance within nation states and between religions and rebels who may or may not follow international law regarding war crimes? I don't believe they took up that issue. They take it in piecemeal. The Pope will speak about peace generally, for instance. We hear a lot of that here. That's fine, but it's a little deeper than just peace. It's a long history in all these countries and all these places. The Middle East, perhaps most of all, but even the United States, we've had religious persecution forever. People came to the United States for religious persecution in several colonies, and people fled those colonies for west to escape the Mormons. If you know about the Mormons, escape to Salt Lake City out of persecution. It's a thing it gives you kind of despair. When is that issue going to disappear? Perhaps never.
Yeah, I mean, talk about what's
a long-lasting problem.
going on. Yeah. Also, I mean, it's about the amalgamation of problems, right? In every religion, you just said it very categorically. I mean, every religion has different, and it's about the lack of institutionalism, and also it's lack of leadership as well. Let's put it this way, because I mean, leadership establishes when there is a unanimity, right, among those groups, but it's never been the case with Christians or Muslims for that matter. So I'll be more optimistic. I would request you to talk about what's lying ahead of us, right, in terms of what are some helpful trends or emerging initiatives that could offer protection and empowerment to religious minorities facing persecution in conflict-affected zones, or the ethnic minorities for that matter. It's for all.
Well, yeah, there aren't too many helpful trends. In a way, you see that the Christians aren't flooding back to Syria, for instance. They're waiting for some concrete signs. It's true, again, if we had international law or even international consensus on this issue. Let's take Syria again, which is the subject I've been focusing most on in recent weeks. We have a problem. The United States, Russia, Iran are at odds with each other on other issues. Can they get together on this issue? Maybe, but maybe not. They're hardly talking to each other. Again, it's a little bit like the issue I was talking about. Can within countries, opposite political parties get together? Can around the United States and Russia, let's just say, and the Syrians, of course, themselves, get together on this? That this one aspect is of interest to us. There could be other aspects of it, but this should reign. This kind of religious freedoms and lack of persecution in Syria should exist, and there should be some way not to force minorities, especially, to support or not support things that they think are wrong politically. Forget about religiously. I don't see how that can happen. The United States may make an appeal for in general, make an appeal for human rights. They've already talked about that. Is Moscow making the same appeal? Is Iran an Islamic State, after all, making that appeal? It's not. And as long as somebody's out and not doing it, this makes it difficult for it to hold. We'll see what Jalani, the new ruler apparently of Syria, says about and does about this issue. It could be important. But remember, Erdogan, who seems to have supported his faction, Jalani's faction, I know I'm getting off the subject, he converted the what was once the Santa Sofia Church, which then became a mosque, which then became a museum, back into a mosque. Now, I don't know that devout Muslims in Turkey are against that, but it was a symbol that, again, Islam is numero uno. It's not. We're not in the time of the creation of the post empire era of Turkish of Istanbul. We're not. That's gone. But what are we into now? Is it going to be like Turkey? I'm talking about Syria. Is it going to be like one might say, but in a different level, obviously, like Lebanon, which at least has tried to address these three different religions within their border? Is it going to be like the United States? No force, no repression of religion. He hasn't spoken on that yet, and I don't know what is going to happen. He sounds more Muslim Brotherhood-like in a way, Islam number one, but maybe some room for the other religions. I mean, there's 2 million, at least 2 million outside of Syria. That's not quite a tenth of the population of Syria. It's not a small number in any way. We'll see, but I'm not that optimistic for what you propose, that they can get together. You need, I mean, now it's called secularism, but you need recognition that the state should not have a role in religions. They should not have to depend on the state. We even have this, they have this from the United States about this connection between religions and the and the state as far as education. There's always some tension, but at least try to separate the government functions from the practice of religion, and try to separate the practice of religion from the functions of government. Now, remember, the Pope, the Catholic Church was ran a part of Italy. Central Italy was a papal state. There is no papal state. He was driven. The Pope was in the 19th century driven into the Vatican. The Pope at the time refused to leave the Vatican to visit what was then called Italy. That was finally broken when the Pope John Paul II visited the Parliament here for the first time. But that was, 15 years ago or so. So these things are not easy. That's what's required. We'll see what kind of. It would be nice if some country, maybe Syria would be a good one to set an example. I doubt it. But too many wars going on for me to be very optimistic about this.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for such an insightful discussion, for such an insightful discourse. The purpose of this discourse was to again disseminate knowledge on the pressing issues that the Christian minorities are facing in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And we did cover many of the pressing issues. You categorically mentioned about choosing sides, depending on the situation and what happens once the situation gets softens up, right? And you have masterfully crafted the historical overview as well in your entire discussion, which was really connecting and really insightful for our listeners as well. So I do have other questions, but I won't be holding you back because it's already been an hour or so. Just quickly, last 30 seconds, your message, what we are doing. Again, you did talk about a lot of lessons. I would, let's say, propose that let's collaborate perhaps on bringing those political leaders or those countries for the sake of humanity as well. Let's initiate some sort of semblance for the sake of humanity. And on the question of, do we need to revisit the international laws as well? So I mean, yeah.
I think there's two aspects of what we've talked about: the issue of law, of leaders getting together. I mentioned before, and I'm going to repeat again, that I was very lucky because since I worked a long time in the Middle East, to be among Muslims who protected me, who knew the situation in those countries, and who were tolerant. Now, I don't want to pretend that everyone's like this. Maybe these men were more educated. Maybe these men were just being nice to me because I was paying their salary. But I firmly believe that there is a basis of tolerance in Islam, but in many places, that perhaps they're somehow suspended because of political situation. I remember when I talk to people younger than me who grew up in Egypt before Sadat, in fact, when Muslim-Christian relations in Egypt were rather soft. If anything, they were maybe too soft for the parents. They would go out, leave class, the Muslims and the Christians smoke cigarettes and do all sorts of funny stuff. It seemed more normal. And there was no religion taught in those schools. You were able to taught outside, but not in school. That's changed in Egypt, and the atmosphere has changed in Egypt. My relation with Muslims, of course, has been ideal in a way. I owe these people my life in many cases. So it is hard for me to accept the idea that some of these things cannot be resolved. That's just me, though. I could be wrong, but this would be my hope, because I have met so many, and also on the Christian side and on the Jewish side, you see people who are truly tolerant, truly willing to practice their religion, but not enforce it on others, much less say, I'm in power now, you support me, or you might end up in one of those jails like in Syria. That I firmly believe people want that kind of freedom to be with each other in countries like the Middle East, but also in Asia, where these religions have been together a long time. It's not like yesterday. They can, I think that, but it's all those things we've talked about. States, the elite, the professional politicians must act and speak plainly. And then people must also be able to feel that they have a voice and they can express. I mean, Arab Spring in Egypt began with Christians and Muslims together. There was I put it in, when I did a podcast, I did lectures, there was a sort of a flag that had the crescent and the cross intertwined. I know these people. They're mostly young. Maybe they were middle class. I can't give the full panorama of it. They understood right away that Egypt could be, and maybe once was, a state that, even though Christians were in a minority, they had a Christian history. It was very long. They have a Muslim history, very long, and they were living together for a long time, and they could live together under some sort of democratic thing. Because remember, Arab Spring began in Egypt, not with al-Sisi, the present guy, but with an idea for democracy. And that's what they believe. Now, those, I haven't been back. I know a lot of them. Well, I know some who were thrown in jail, Muslims, not Christians. Others Christians who now we're quiet because again, they're thrown in the same problem they were thrown in before. They must support the regime. They must support the government, and all minorities must, in the end, face this issue. But I myself know that somewhere in the hearts of Christians and Muslims and Jews, somewhere, even if only one speaks out, it means there's that feeling somewhere. And I'm not optimistic, but this is my hope. I've been with too many Muslims in my recent career to think that, oh, well, these Muslims are bad people. I just don't believe that. So I could be wrong.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your wonderful remarks. And that's it for today.